I'm Deborah Gordon. And welcome to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm a senior associate in the Energy and Climate program here. And among other energy and climate issues, Carnegie's working on transportation in cities, which is what got us excited about Andreas Kopp, the World Bank's new report, Turning the Right Corner. It was at an event, I think, back in October when Andreas asked a question of the panelists when it became clear that the World Bank was working on this report, and it sounded exciting and interesting to things that we are thinking about on cities and transport, that we asked him to come and talk about the report, which is all but ready to be released. It would have been here, but it's all approved, but it's not yet at the printer. So Andreas will tell you how to get a copy. A little bit of background. I should mention that I'm filling in very happily for my esteemed colleague, David Burwell, who directs the Energy and Climate Program here at Carnegie. His wife, unfortunately, is fine, but she had a hospitalization last night. She will be fine, but that's why you're seeing me up here and not David, if you were expecting to see David Burwell. Just in terms of background, although we've gotten, I feel, a temporary reprieve from transport, energy issues, growth because of the economic downturn, and that has not been a happy reprieve, but it's a reality. Transportation has not grown as quickly, and mobility has not grown as quickly in the most recent years, but all projections are for mobility to keep growing by leaps and bounds. In a book that I wrote with Dan Sperling, 2 Billion Cars, that came out a couple of years ago, we charted this eventual doubling of motor vehicle ownership and obviously use in the next decade or two. It's not knowable when exactly that will happen, but we do know that the world is marching upward in terms of its motor vehicles. And how we're going to meet those growing global mobility needs in a carbon-constrained world is a huge issue for us. Collectively, a huge issue for us. And the fuels are largely recarbonizing. We're seeing this with the debate now on unconventional oil. We're going to find oil in places that have much more carbon associated with them. And there then comes the question of, how do you solve this? How do you address it? We've talked a lot. I've done this in my work with these 3 legs of the stool. It will mean transforming the car. It will mean transforming the fuels that go into mobility. And then it will mean what we're going to talk about here today, which is transforming mobility itself by many different ways. The hope is there. Cities are growing. There's a lot of work to be done, but it has to be done correctly, and the right policies need to be set and put in place, or else we're going to see a back to the future nature of the developing world that we've seen in the developed world. So this is how we are going to proceed. I'll give you bios in a second. Andreas will make a presentation for about 30 minutes of the report. Shin-pei Tsai will then give about 5-10 minutes of comments. Then Kai will give about 5 or 10 minutes of comments. And Andreas will have a few minutes to respond, maybe about 5, and then we want to save the last 25-30 minutes for discussion with all of you, which we're looking forward to. So very briefly, in terms of bios, Andreas Kopp is the lead economist at the Department of Transport, Water, and Information and Communication Technologies at the World Bank, where his work focuses on transport, economic geography, and climate change. Before joining the World Bank, he was the chief economist and head of research at the Transport Research Center at the OECD, and prior to the OECD, he held a professorship at the Technical University of Dresden, teaching macroeconomics and regional science. In order, Shin-pei Tsai is the director of the Cities and Transportation Project here at Carnegie Endowment in the Energy and Climate Program. Her research focuses on federal, state, local transportation policy, climate change, and urban and regional planning issues with an emphasis on economic development. And prior to joining Carnegie, Shin-pei served as the Deputy Director of Transportation Alternatives, the Chief Operating Officer of the Project for Public Spaces, and a strategy consultant with a company serving the Fortune 500. And Kai Oxhausen is a professor of transport planning at the ETH, in Zurich, and previously he worked at the Leopold Franzens University in Innsbruck and at the University of Oxford. He's been involved in the measurement and modeling of travel behavior for the last 25 years, and his current work focuses on agent-based microstimulation toolkit, MatSims. So with that, we welcome Andreas.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here, and I was excited about the interest we found after we had this discussion with Dan Sperling. You have probably read an awful lot of stuff on climate change and also on climate change and development. So why is it important for the World Bank to have another one? What we have in our report is quite different from what you read in other publications. I know that the International Energy Agency presents its reports in here too, and what they have as the message on transport is quite different from what our message is. For the IEA, the process of the sector, of the global transport sector to decarbonize is one of changing engine technologies. And as you will see, we are not very optimistic about that the change in engine technologies will do the trick to decarbonize transport. What we need is a difference in mobility patterns. And this is what is the core of the difference in the message that we come up with. And we also talk about how to get there. While you read a lot about decarbonization as getting away from the habits we have being painted as bad, we cannot subscribe to this view what transport is concerned. In 2009, I was co-author of a World Development Report on development and economic geography, which forcefully makes the point that transport drives development. Lower transport costs lead to the opening up of trade, of giving access to markets, and driving the urbanization process, which makes the workforce and capital more productive. This is the role of transport in development, and what our report is about to maintain this function of transport in a carbon-constrained world. And this is what is also part of our strategy that has been launched in 2008, which has the subtitle Safe, Clean and Affordable. What we need is a narrative on the transport sector that goes beyond the narrow agenda of reducing travel times and direct transport costs. Many people are afraid that talking about decarbonization of transport is something that conflicts with development. And this graph gives you an impression on how energy use in transport develops with countries becoming richer. And it is pretty clear that with countries having a higher per capita income, the energy use in transport increases. But you can also see that there are enormous differences, and that the differences become bigger the richer the countries get. And in this cloud, you can identify three subgroups. There are the high emitters, that is North America and the Arab countries and some of the BRICS. There is a middle range of largely European countries that have very high per capita incomes, but far lower per capita energy use in transport. And there is the lower bound of the cloud, which is Asian countries. There are the examples of Hong Kong and Singapore, which might be special cases because they have a very particular geography and they could not sprawl. But Korea, Japan, they are all examples of where you have a relatively low energy intensity of transport. And all these countries have been the development miracles of the last decades. So at the face of it, there is no conflict between having a rapid development and having a low energy intensity in transport. One of the main messages is that a narrow climate agenda does not get much political traction. Wherever we look, the discussions of the UNFCCC, the resources that have been attracted to transport out of dedicated climate funds, it is all failure. Transport does not play a role, and we believe that it is due to the fact that a narrow climate change agenda in transport leads to the result, for those who want to invest in decarbonization, that it is very expensive to get emission reductions done in the transport sector, and that it is way easier to do so in the energy sector, in housing, and in industry. This is based on the fact that the technological perspectives of the transport sector are not as bright as in other sectors. And this leads us to the conclusion that the picture has to change by having a broader reform discussion that includes other external costs of transport, other negative side effects of transport. And if we address all these problems at the same time, then the return by investing in a decarbonization in the transport sector is far higher than in other sectors. It completely changes the relative competitiveness for reform agendas. And we believe that we cannot assume that we will achieve the policy objectives without having a substantial fiscal implementation agenda. All of these countries you saw that form the lower bound of the cloud, that are the high income, low energy intensity countries in transport, in all these countries it is relatively expensive to use your car. And I will talk a bit about what this means in institution-wise, that we need policy coordination if we want to go into such a broad reform agenda. First, I want to make the argument that we cannot expect that technical change in engines will do the trick of decarbonizing transport. Even under optimistic assumptions on technical change, the emissions will increase, largely because of the surge in motorization in the developing countries that is to be expected. It is like a natural law when you see that countries arrive at a per household income of $8,000 to $10,000 per year, then they want to have a car. And the core question of World Bank advice to these countries is, how do we position ourselves to these demands? Mayors want to know, should we accommodate the surge in individual mobility or should we contain it? And should we go for alternative systems? And we have to have very good arguments to convince the mayors that it is not a good way to go down the road of accommodating individual car use, because it is likely to lead to higher future transport costs, because there might be a supply constraint in the oil market, and there might be a policy consensus that the international community decides to tax carbon to contain climate change. And in transport, this is the picture what would happen if there is no intervention in transport, if there is no policy narrative to contain the use of oil in transport. Then you see that even in the short run, or in the next 2 decades, transport will become by far the dominant user of the oil reserves. This is the most left-hand side column in this graph. And the right-hand graph shows, and this is the forecast of the Department of Energy of the US, that nothing will change until, technology-wise, until the year 2080, where biotechnology and fuel cell cars are expected to become economically viable. Transport would just rush into ever consuming more oil. This is what's going to happen if there is policy intervention of a particular kind. This graph is from the International Energy Agency, and the International Energy Agency focuses on decarbonization by the change of engine technologies. They expect that this will be brought about by the global community accepting that there are global technical standards that will be tightened over time to make cars ever more fuel efficient. The global community will, in a sequence of decisions, force the world to renew their cars and to have more fuel efficient cars. But even under this scenario, the overall emissions would increase, and they would increase dramatically from now, even over the next decades. And this is why technical standards, even if we assume that these technical standards are implemented, that transport would grow into the largest emitter of CO2 emissions. This was the perspective of the IPCC in their last major report, and the big technologies we have to hope for to decarbonize transport without a change in mobility patterns are either biofuels or fuel cell cars. And you all have read about the futures of these technologies, and biofuels is something that scares the World Bank, because if we do not find a feedstock that grows on soils that do not compete with food production, there may be a competition between fueling cars and people having food on the table. The other constraint for a biofuel future is water. The feedstocks that do not compete with food must in addition have the quality that they don't need much water. Otherwise, the world runs into a water constraint. And fuel cell car research is something that has lost its glamour, and it is cut down also in the United States to a large extent. And we have to ask ourselves how confident we can be that these technologies will do much to decarbonize transport in the foreseeable future. This is the alternative policy scenario, and this has been done by the PNNL for the Department of Energy. What would we need as a carbon price? What would we need as a carbon price to drive the world to a decarbonization that contains global warming to 2 degrees Celsius? That was the question. And these are the price paths that would be required, and there are several of them depending on technological progress in the energy sector. And the big elephants in the room are carbon capture and storage, or the availability of biofuel technology, of which I have talked about already. If both technological revolutions in the energy sector are not forthcoming, then carbon prices would have to go up to over $6,000 per ton of carbon by the end of the century to get to this stabilization objective that is a G8 objective of not having more warming than 2 degrees Celsius. If there is a lot of technological progress in the energy sector, then the increase will be much smaller, and it would just go a bit higher than $1,000 per ton of carbon. And this is what would happen in terms of energy use in transport, even under these scenarios of carbon pricing. Even if these carbon prices are implemented, the transport sector, which is the turquoise part of the column, would grow into being the greatest consumer of oil. And this is what's going to happen if there are the revolutions in the energy sector. The ideal solution would be that carbon storage, capture and storage is something that becomes economically viable in many places. Then the carbon price would go down that much that the decarbonization of transport becomes less likely, because the carbon price does not increase much to change the character of the carbon sector. And this is why we feel that we need a broader reform agenda to increase the policy intensity. And why do we need such a policy intensity now? That is because there are long time lags of transport and settlement systems to adapt. There is an enormous inertia created by the infrastructure we already have. Once you have invested heavily into a road system, once mayors have decided to accommodate the surge in motorization demand, you have sunk the investments in a road system, and it is very uneconomical. It seems very irrational to change the path at a later time. This might mean that you run into higher transport costs when the other parameters change in the future, because you have, so to speak, the infrastructure already there without any opportunity costs. This replicates itself a bit on the level of the individual households, because once you have bought a rather gas-using SUV, you cannot sell it immediately, even if you change your mind, without having major losses to incur, because the price of these vehicles go down. So there is an inertia in consumer behavior too. And all this requires that you send signals early on that you want a different future for the transport sector to make it happen later on. A mitigation agenda and an adaptation agenda also needs a lot of financial resources, and our argument is that smart mitigation policies can help to finance this path to a different mobility pattern in the future. The incremental costs for adaptation, even if we don't do a mitigation policy, is estimated to be $1.6 to $26 billion annually, and the vast differences in the numbers comes from what is recognized as being the catch-up gap of the developing countries. If we feel that there should be no infrastructure growth in developing countries, then most of the adaptation need occurs in the rich countries, because they have a lot of infrastructure. But the 26 billion annually as additional costs for adaptation is probably an underestimate if we take into account that there is a huge under-endowment in infrastructure in developing countries. And mitigation costs are even more difficult to estimate. There's only the attempt of the International Energy Agency, and they estimate that we need $100 billion annually between now and 2020, and that this would increase to $300 billion annually from then to 2030 to arrive at the objectives, the outcomes that I have shown in the initial graphs. And because the IEA has this particular policy perspective, this would be something that you and I have to spend in car renewal. We would be forced by the tighter emission standards to change our cars to more fuel-efficient ones, and all these costs would rather be borne by us and not by governments, unless governments decide to subsidize our fleet renewal. In contrast to these huge financial needs, transport has been next to absent in all the carbon financing schemes, and there is a lot of discussion what to do about it. There is a strong uneasiness about it, but there is not a clear, there is something that we hope to contribute to how this could possibly change. The most drastic example of the failure of transport to attract attention in climate policies is maybe the CDM mechanism. There are not more than 3 out of 2,200 registered projects, and the means allocated, this is the surplus that results from cap and trade schemes, and which is supposed to be recycled into the economy to reduce the energy intensity. Of these resources, transport has attracted not more than 0.11%. So it's next to nothing. And in the Global Environmental Fund of the United Nations, there have been 28 transport projects accepted over 20 years, attracting not more than 6.4% of the resources. This against the background that in all likelihood the transport sector is to grow in being the main emitter among all the sectors competing for these resources. The World Bank administers the Clean Technology Fund, and they have a percentage of 16.7 in transport on average, which is something that is under discussion because it lacks these technology fund project perspective, lacks the demand side intervention that I will talk about, and which risks therefore a mismatch between supply and demand. There is a single-minded focus on having bus projects and mass transit projects without accompanying incentives on the demand side. I have already talked about the reasons why this picture is so dismal. There is the fact that transport intervention is more expensive than intervention in other sectors, and these committees deciding on how funds should be allocated, they have an understanding about the risks on the demand side. If you replace a coal power plant by a wind park, then it is clear that you will have about the same set of users once you have changed the technology. There is no simple analogy in transport. You have to change people's behavior and the millions of decisions that are taken at the individual level to get to a lower energy intensity, and therefore there is this demand side effect lacking, which makes the investors cautious to invest in climate action in the transport sector. The problem is also that if we have a narrow climate change agenda, that the intervention will not be strong enough to really change behaviors. What a carbon price should be is something that we can only identify from the large-scale integrated assessment models, like the Nordhaus study, like the Stern report. And they come up with different carbon prices. And the differences in the carbon prices is not due to the fact that they see climate change differently or that they see the policies that should be implemented differently, but because there is this controversy on discounting. And the Stern report puts forward the ethical position that discounting the interest of future generations is unethical, and that therefore there should be no discounting at all. If we do this, then we get the highest carbon price now. That carbon price would be $300 per ton of carbon. If that were implemented in the United States, it would change the gasoline prices at the gas station by only 70 cents. And we have seen in the past couple of years the price go up and down by more than these 70 cents without leading to a fundamental change in mobility patterns. So a carbon agenda, a narrow carbon agenda, does not lead to a policy intensity that really makes a change, at least not in the United States of America. A broad reform agenda, and I will show you that the other problems the transport sector has are far more important quantitatively, changes the picture. We could formulate the climate change agenda as something that leads to reduction in CO2 emissions, but also reduces congestion and also reduces local air pollution, and therefore has more benefits than are usually considered to be generated in the evaluations of climate change agendas. And this is why we favor a broad reform agenda to a low carbon sector, and that reduces the costs of the carbon sector. The big ticket items for this reform are congestion, health costs of local air pollution, accident costs on top of the climate change effects of transport. And quantitatively, these so-called co-benefits are far more important for policy than climate change policies. This gives you the example for Washington area, because the cost of local air pollution are local, because congestion costs are local depending on population density and your urban configuration, they are local. And this is, you cannot talk globally about these cost items, but this is the picture for Washington done by Resources for the Future. The first column shows how much should be charged as an optimal policy to contain the external costs of transport in the different types of external costs of transport. And you see in the left-hand column, and the first item is the greenhouse gas effects. They are calculated as 6 cents per gallon to account for a carbon price of $50 per ton of carbon. That would be the consequence on the gallon price. And the biggest item is congestion. If we were to contain the congestion problems of Washington, we would have to implement a congestion charge equivalent to 105 cents per gallon. And the next biggest item is accidents, which is 63 cents per gallon that would have to be imposed to contain the accidents by charging on gasoline. I do not suggest that that would be a good idea. It is only to give a comparative overview on the quantitative importance of the different problems that the transport sector generates. So if we take all these things together, then the reform intensity would be much bigger than an ineffective, narrow climate change agenda. And we make the point that there is the risk of a mismatch of supply and demand if climate change policies is focusing strongly just on the supply side, which is something that is much on the mind of many people because the thinking comes from the energy sector. There it is about changing the type of the power plant you want to deploy. And in transport, it's different. In transport, you need something on the demand side to avoid that there is a mismatch between supply and demand. In the United States of America, the supply efforts to increase the share of mass transit has led to nothing but decreasing load factors, and emissions per passenger kilometer in mass transit that is higher than for the average individual car. And they are not small in the United States compared to other countries. And this is a challenge that developing countries would face not immediately, but would face in the future, and on top of running the risk in getting into a dysfunctional infrastructure. And this is why we want to propose a fiscal implementation program and be more specific about what should be done with the revenues coming from such a fiscal implementation program. And these the revenues are substantial. They are far more than peanuts. If a carbon tax were implemented in the US with a carbon price of 24 or 145 of 20, 30 or $300 per ton of carbon, the Treasury would have a revenue overall of 10, 24, or 145 billion US dollars. Compare that to the discussion on raising the debt ceiling, on how to reduce the deficit. It is something that is substantial and would change the discussion. For the same holds for local air pollution charges. If a charge of 8 cents per mile were implemented, as was proposed by Ken Small a number of years ago, this would lead to a revenue in the District 7 of Caltrans of $40 billion annually. And the health costs and the need for charges are not lower in developing countries. There is the health costs of local air pollution for Beijing, for example, is estimated to be $3.5 billion annually. And in the long run, fiscal measures work. If we compare the histories of charges in Europe and in the United States, it gives a basis of explaining the differences between the continents. North Americans consume 4 to 6 times more fuel in transport than the Europeans, without an enormous difference in the mobility patterns, by the way. Had all OECD countries had the fuel prices of North America, the emissions and fuel use had been 30% higher than it was for all of the OECD, and that is a lot of oil demand. Had all countries had taxation levels like the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, oil consumption in transport would have been 44% lower. 44% lower oil demand in the transport sector in the OECD world is an awful lot of energy. And all this requires also that institutions dealing with the reform policy come out of their silos. The broad reform agenda needs a lot of coordination between different agencies on a horizontal level, and it needs coordination across jurisdictional levels. In some countries, we see that mayors who have recognized that it would be useful to embark on reform policies for transport don't do so because they fear that it weakens their competitiveness to other cities. And if all mayors think the same way, then this could induce a race to the bottom. So there is growing evidence that where the national level helps to coordinate among the cities, that this can help a reform agenda in transport. And the transport project, the fiscal implementation agenda is something that goes beyond the local level. What would be needed is a discussion of fiscal policies at the national level. The revenues, if there is no earmarking of the into expenditures, could be used to reduce other taxes. In many of the rapidly growing developing country cities, we have the problem of a growing informal sector. And the growing informal sector this problem is the more you tax labor. And there is an opportunity to contain the increase of the informal sector by using revenues from doing the right thing in the transport sector, and you can substitute charging goods like labor by charging bads in form of the external costs of the transport sector. At the global level, there is a discussion now to go this way, to have more a programmatic approach to reform rather than this project approach that has had so little effect in the CDM. And these are the overall messages. It is all about protecting the mobility function for development in a carbon-constrained world. Reducing fossil fuel use now will lead to lower transport costs in the future if the oil price increases or if the world decides to implement carbon prices. Greening the sector will contribute to to reducing the funding deficits of the sector and of public households overall. And implementing the fiscal measures can lead to a double dividend by allowing to do reform efforts outside the transport sector. And this is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andreas. Shin-pei, would you like to start?
Yeah, can I stay here?
Sure.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Andreas, for the insightful research and for highlighting the importance of transportation, especially for energy and climate change concerns. I wanted to talk a little bit today about starting from a little bit of my experience. I have worked on this project by project basis, and I think what Andreas offers here and the World Bank offers here is a framework for the coordination that's required to accelerate the implementation of low carbon infrastructure. He goes into a lot of different areas in which the global community could be working on this, but I think broadening the impacts and the implications of transportation to meet development goals really is a way that we have to start considering the critical need for transportation in every conversation. If I look at just the broad millennium goals that are going to be up in 2015, every single one of them needs transportation in order to fully fulfill their potential. Ending hunger, food security and access completely relies on transportation. Universal education, providing a convenient and inexpensive way for children and their caretakers to get to school is something that's critical to education. Gender equity, independence. So I think there's lots of different ways that we can think about this, and I think including the co-benefits and the cost of providing transportation is incredibly important. Oftentimes these development goals are thought about as though they are abstract and they're rootless, as though hunger happens in the air and not in specific places. And I think the other phenomenon that we're seeing, which is incredibly important to the idea of sustainable transportation, is the urbanization effect. And I think that in some ways you could argue that the urban form is very much informed by transport systems. And just to give you a bit of a context in terms of where the world is going and where the world population is going, so currently we think that there's about 53% of the global population that dwells in cities, so more than half. And but in terms of the actual space they occupy, it's less than 2% of landmass. 75% of the population will be expected to be in cities by 2050. So in some ways, this is really an opportunity for us to think about providing mobility and meeting the development goals in a very geographically oriented manner. The coordination effort is extremely critical, and I think that's why this report lays out why we need to scale policy between the local policy, which is really where the details matter significantly, to national policy, which is where you get the fiscal incentives and the coordination so that you don't have the race to the bottom. I think that, in some ways, sustainable transport strategies are much more cost efficient than other strategies that a nation can pursue. So for example, some of the more popular things, but of course, very much dependent on context, bike share systems, mega bike share systems, integrated bike share systems, integrated transit systems, looking at low-cost transit solutions, not driving transport decisions through their technology deployment. So we're not going straight to the subway, but maybe looking at existing infrastructure and using existing assets so that you don't get the high carbon investments, I think is incredibly critical. And in spite of all this, I do want to point out that transport is kind of an underlying critical backbone to all these goals, and it really does not receive the attention that it should receive. In the latest Zero document draft that's been submitted to the Rio Plus 20 Commission, transport's mentioned once. Energy gets its play now, and cities get their play, and obviously there's a very strong connection between cities, energy, and transportation. So we think that there's a lot more room for improvement. Just because it's in the document doesn't mean anything again. So it goes back to the fact that there has to be local policy and incentives. I guess I just want to end with a couple of examples where I think where I want to highlight how a national agenda can and the local agenda really need to connect both on the supply and the demand side. Many of the developing countries have intense urbanization, and so maybe their national governments are setting targets for housing units. If a country adopts housing units, say like every development there's 1 million units that you need to provide, if they adopt a local policy, which is New York City's off-street parking minimum of 1.6 ratio per housing unit, you're gonna get, for 1 million housing units, 1.6 parking spaces off-street. That's an incredible waste of space. It's an incredible waste of funding. And I think, so that's just a small example of the level of coordination that really needs to happen. That's replicated in the 100+ megacities that are expected to develop in some of the larger developing world countries. We're going to see an incredible waste of resources, and we're not going to see the climate mitigation efforts that we really need to see. So I wanted to leave you with that there's incredible opportunity in the face of the challenges that are currently in play.
Thank you, Kai.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I think I was invited not so much for the current work on microsimulation, but for work we have done on tracing the change of accessibility in Switzerland over the last 150 years and their interaction with urban form, population, and productivity. And that work picks up on a lot of ongoing work, particularly in England, on the link between accessibility and productivity of the population and of the economy. I think this is a topic which gets a bit too little attention in this report, but Andreas pointed out that he had just written an earlier report, but it might be useful to highlight that in the final version, because I think that's the key fight we are going to have. And the question is, how can this accessibility be maintained in a world in which carbon is properly priced? And quite clearly, the examples he shows of governments throwing away money in Nigeria and Saudi Arabia by not taxing fuel at all, or essentially not taxing it like in the US, is incredibly wasteful. So I think this link between accessibility and productivity needs, I think, the key attention because that maintains the necessary development, particularly in third world and emerging countries where they do need much more efficient transport systems to allow the population to be fed, to be educated, to participate in the world economy at appropriate levels. Having said that, one has to realize that this link between income and VMT, travels, is very, very strong. That's a very strong joint development. And so the question is, how can we enable the population, which has become richer, to engage in the travel they need and want to have, participating in productive endeavors, but also enjoying the income in leisure form. So the question is, how can we offer that level of travel, that level of enjoyment, without destroying the climate? So that is the second challenge, which I think needs to be addressed. Having said that, it is clear that accessibility, so improvement in the transport systems, be they rails, be they public transport systems, locals, be they roads, have a very, very strong positive impact on vehicle miles traveled. We demonstrated that elasticity in Switzerland, and it's very, very strong. So you get elasticities around 0.6, 0.7. So every unit of elasticity added approximately adds the same amount of travel. So the question becomes, how can we get all of that together while the co-benefits are being maintained? And that raises the issue of urban form. But before I come to that, I would like to highlight the point again made in one of the figures in the report about the enormous path dependency in behavior. What Andreas said as well, the moment a society gets used to a certain price level, it's next to impossible to get it away from it. The moment we have all assumed that prices will be certain ways, the political system will try to maintain that stable point. And so the best you can do is never get to that point. You shouldn't even start from there. So I think the US and places like Saudi Arabia will have a hard time to get away from that stable point, but some of the countries where they aren't quite there yet, which aren't quite rich enough yet to be used to having a car at essentially no fuel tax, they might want to change quickly. And that's, I think, the point he makes in the report, and to overcome that. But independently of the pricing levels, I think you have to look at the urban form. And I want to contradict him a bit when he said that Singapore has no sprawl. Singapore has enormous sprawl, but it is organized in a way that it hasn't led to much VMT, because it happens all into 15 stories, 30 stories skyscrapers put closely together with appropriate local services and MRT underground stations next to it. So the question is, what urban form are we building? And where we have built, how do we rebuild? And I think the World Bank, given its position, might usefully talk with urban designers on this question, come up not so much with detailed designs, but with grammars and rules of how to build. And so that the local level can take the individual decisions to adapt and respond to individual needs, but that there is a certain sets of understandings how it works. For example, one of the most important reports which American engineers have done was the Ashter Report of 1950. This is the American Association of State Highway Officials, which in the 1950s put together a green book of how the world should be. And this book was applied everywhere. And it traded on certain expectations, that roads are wide, that about every 2 miles you have a motorway, and on and on. And these types of rules, when they get embedded, form the environment. And I think that's one lever which the international system has to work at this crucial point to avoid many, many more Atlantas around the world. Maybe not Atlanta, whatever. And with that, I want to close with one point which puts a bit of argues against what I have said. I think there's another concern which hasn't been addressed in this report, and it hadn't to be, which is the discussion about inequality. It's inequality within societies, inequality between societies. And clearly, transport and accessibility makes what Robert Frank calls winner-takes-all societies a lot more easy. And winner-takes-all societies tend to be societies with very massive social inequalities attached to them. So one of the other challenges which we have as we improve accessibility, how do we maintain an appropriate level of inequality, but not an excessive level of inequality in societies? And that is a question which we need, because we certainly don't want an equal society. That doesn't work. The Russians have tried that. So we have to have an appropriate level of inequality, but not one where society as a whole feels that government and the national political system doesn't serve their needs. So this is a challenge which we will have to address as we go along, taxing fuel and taxing transportation at appropriate levels and building cities which are worthwhile living in.
Thank you both very much. Andreas, do you have, I don't know if you want to respond to anything before we open up the floor?
Yes, no, thank you very much. Very, very exciting comments, and maybe the beginning of a new research program. Of course, urban form is something that excites us. Kai and me, we are in a program on mega cities around the world, and what was revealing to me in this program is that the problems of the developing country cities and the leitmotifs of the urban planners in the rich countries are something that is disconnected and dissonant. In the rich countries, there is talk about making cities more compact, but many developing countries, cities, the poorer they are, the more, are very compact. They have a mixed land use in inner cities, but they are relatively poor. The thing is that the growth of the cities has a tendency to drive out these traditional quarters from the inner cities to the outskirts of the cities, and that there is a process of separation of residential and production locations that needs to transport demands. This leads to the delicate question of what does this to agglomeration economies, and what would we do to the agglomeration economies if we contain it, or if we influence it as transport policymakers. And I think there's an awful lot to do to have a clearer picture about this. To me, it is a question of thinking more proactively about how monocentric cities can evolve into a polycentric structure where you have a division of labor that allows for less of a separation of jobs and residential locations. And I think there is a lot to learn. The second issue that is, of course, much of a challenge of what we have presented is the acceptability of the fiscal implementation story. And I think much could be done to sell it much more as the fiscal incentives being prices for services, to talk much more about what is achieved by having these fiscal mechanisms, and by being more upfront about what you want to do with the revenues. I know that there is an enormous credibility problem for policymakers because they tend to not to stick to announced uses if you have commitments in the first place, and you have other political problems when the expenditure times arrives. But the World Bank has worked on this problem. There is the history of the bank trying to help maintenance expenditures in road infrastructure by creating funds. It has created all kinds of difficulties, but there is there is experience and successes in getting revenue self-financing programs in transport, getting tractions in developing countries, and we may have to do more of this. The third thing is changing the books of the engineers. I mean, this is something that is a challenge and that we are actively working on. The work I have presented here will be translated into an evaluative framework for projects and policies that go beyond what the bank uses now. We ourselves have these rule books where the benefits of transport are just travel time savings and reductions of the maintenance costs of the vehicle fleet. And we are working hard on getting a broader understanding of what transport is good for. And interestingly, on the inequality point, it is true that that inequality is something that has to be taken care of concretely here by the question whether this fiscal implementation will hit the poor particularly. And I think there is a difference between rich countries and poor countries in this respect, because it's the relatively wealthy who drive the energy-intensive cars in developing countries, and the poor are normally not using individual motorization to get to work, which makes a big difference. But in the review process in the bank has asked me to add a box on the distributional issues, so it is something that concerns many people. I'm not so sure that the inequality problem is just a problem of advanced winner-takes-all societies. Capitalism starts out from a feudal society where land ownership very much determines the inequality and the persistence of inequality. And the Soviet Union had come to the limits with having an equal society and has implemented a neo-feudal society where some people who own the mines and the natural resources of the country are the new feudal class, leading to possibly a very persistent, long-lasting inequality in these countries before they can arrive at a winner-takes-all society that characterizes maybe the US. Thank you very much for the very interesting comments.
So now, as promised, we'd love to have the discussion. Hannah, do you have, there's a microphone because we're filming, so Owen Kamula has two. So raise your hand if you have a question, and please introduce yourself so we all know who we're talking to.
Hi, Henry Hetker, researcher at NARA. About a year ago at AEI, I was able to ask a question to Newt Gingrich. I asked him about the electric car, and I wondered, do you think anything more should be done to further the electric car? And he indicated that I don't think anything further needs to be done. We already have a tax advantage for it. That's more than enough. Well, in my opinion, I think plenty needs to be done for it. One thing I think needs to be done is that we need chargers available for the vehicle when it arrives at its destination, usually as a commuter at an office building somewhere in town, and then they retreat to the suburbs. It's not always the case, but often is. So what is a worldwide program involved in looking at this? The World Bank is involved here. I don't know how many individuals have looked at this and wondered what to do. I wonder what you experts think ought to be done regarding this.
Andreas? Oh.
May I just briefly say one thing? We have used our microsimulation system and our knowledge about travel behavior and also travel behavior over multiple days to look at the question of the rechargers. And as it turns out, very few people need rechargers because very few people travel enough in a day to exceed the charge. So the question becomes where to optimize the location of chargers for those people who do indeed need recharging, which makes the problem a bit more difficult for policy because it isn't a general across-the-board policy, but one which is localized. So that's would be my answer, but I think the colleagues have others.
Just very briefly, I think that obviously for energy and climate issues, there should be some R&D and deployment of electric vehicles, but when you get down to the space issues, efficiency of people, passenger capacity, how you're going to utilize, you still need a road in order to drive a car, and there are plenty of other ways to use that road. So that's something to think about, especially with the equity issues in the developing countries.
No, I fully agree with what has been said. First of all, globally, it does not seem that electric cars help us much. First of all, to have a decarbonization of transport strategy with electric cars requires that the technical revolutions in the energy sector happen. Either we have to have carbon capture and storage, or we have to have the biofuel technology that leads to emission-free electricity. If we have the biofuels, we can put the biofuel directly into the cars and we don't need the electric cars. If we have both the biofuels and the carbon storage, then the carbon price will go down that much that no one will buy an electric car. So there is a local perspective for having electric cars where you can have relatively cheap renewable energy and where the population is determined to use it a lot. The ideal conditions are maybe in Germany.
Or Switzerland.
Or Switzerland. Well, yes. Buying nuclear energy from France will make it possible.
Hi, Zach Coleman with Smart Grid today. Just to go a little bit further on the electric vehicle, I mean, we talked about, we don't want too many individual cars out there, but what about the idea of more, central planning with public transportation, electric buses, things like that, because that would, eliminate some of the space concerns that you had, and it seems like from a municipal level that would be attainable.
Yeah, I think that looking at vehicle technology and like, different sources of fueling the vehicles is definitely true. I think what tends to happen with electric vehicles is you get boxed into the single passenger type of use, and many of the trips don't require that. Again, it's just a matter of all lining up. There's so many decisions with everyone's transportation trips, so you want to provide options.
But I think public transportation isn't really much a question of what motor you put in, but it's a question of urban form. Because if you have a diesel bus full, depending on the energy mix for the electricity production, you're still better off. So I think public transport is a urban form question more than anything else.
You're still here, and then we'll move over there.
David Stern from ExxonMobil. I heard, Andreas, I appreciate your talk in terms of a lot of different aspects, namely that you need to look at the right policy instruments to really drive behavior. Carbon tax is a great way to do that. You know, you want the economy, you want the markets to work for you and choose the most efficient solutions. Urbanization, shin-pei, is also a phenomenal way to decrease transport energy use. I mean, I'm sure we're all aware of these kinds of studies. Now, having said that, you know, what's interesting to me is the dichotomy between saying that carbon pricing is a great way to do this, and then yet we're going to pick winners and losers that might have minimal impact on GHG efficiency. EVs being one example versus hybrids. Biofuels, which don't really have that much GHG savings overall. You know, sure, there might be some in the future that may end up reducing them. Why not do things that encourage efficiency now? Why not look at things like hybridization that have the potential to make tremendous impacts? If I compare the fuel efficiency of a vehicle in Europe versus the U.S., it's 40% more efficient in Europe, and that's going up even more. That disparity is going to be tremendous. All these new vehicle approaches don't even lead to that kind of delta in efficiency. So why start to pick winners and losers in this game? Why not pick the right policy instruments and let them work in a market-based fashion?
Yes, no, I mean, we strongly agree with you that it should be the countries and the systems and the individuals to choose how to reduce, how to respond to the signals, what is the cost of their behavior. This is what it is about. People should have an idea about what the expected cost of climate change damages is if they use fossil fuels, and they should have an idea about what the local health costs are from emissions of transport at the local level. If they do that and they take their decisions, then we do not prescribe specific technical systems that should be used to respond to this. This is something that is also local, and people will find the best way to respond to it. There is something in the technology discussion that I have not mentioned before. All the advanced, a major part of the decarbonization and greater energy efficiency in the rich countries will come from progress in conventional vehicles. And this makes sense because so many resources have already been sunk into the infrastructure systems that exist. And in developing countries, we have a bit of another problem. We want that we avoid a misallocation of resources in infrastructure investment in the first place. There's also a technology barrier to going the same way in developing countries that we might agree to on for the rich countries. We had a discussion with people from Toyota, and they are reluctant even to sell Priuses to the developing world because you need very qualified and disciplined inspection services of what happens with the batteries. They are afraid that an incident of the recycling service, what the batteries is concerned, destroys the green nimbus of the car and makes it unsellable in the rich countries. So they are very cautious, and they think twice before they embark on a sales strategy of hybrid cars in developing countries. And therefore, this is also a reason why an individual car use strategy in developing countries has even these institutional restrictions that makes it even more necessary to think about different patterns of mobility behavior in the developing countries.
But just on a brief point, in many developed countries, the fuel tax is too low to just maintain the system as is. So some of that push will just come with a need to reduce the potholes on your motorway, never mind your local street. And that will have to be combined in many places with localized road charging to advance congestion relief in an appropriate manner. So I think it will be a two-part strategy. Let's say from a transport planning point of view, it will have to be enough funding to maintain the system as is, plus a localized charging scheme to manage congestion if and where needed.
Over here.
Art Donner, CityOne.com. It seems to me that with all the nuclear power plants that we have and all the waste that we have that's highly radioactive, that there has to be a tremendous amount of energy left in this. Is there any thought to utilizing that energy for the transport sector? Find a way to use it rather than store it and hope it doesn't poison everybody.
I think this is a truly emotional issue, as you know, and certainly the accident and disaster in Fukushima has highlighted the emotional response. The speed with which the Germans and the Swiss have decided to phase out large infrastructure investments is a point in case. So if we trust the engineering systems to deliver safe atomic energy, clearly it will make sense to maintain it. But if the general popular view is that we cannot trust the engineers and we certainly cannot trust the firms which run the systems, then the atomic power will be phased out. And depending on the level of distrust, it will be phased out quicker or slower.
You know, I'll just add, because I find this in, 25 years of working on transportation policy, there's often that disconnect where you'll find articles that talk about nuclear power renewables in the same conversation as transportation, but until and unless we have an electrified transportation system, there's really no connection between transportation and electric power and the power sources of the renewables, the traditional renewables, and nuclear power. So I think that comes up a lot.
But there's still a bit, because clearly the electrical system is implicated in the railways and urban electrified public transport. Clearly, they don't
to a
really
less extent.
need atomic power plants to be operated, but still it's one
Right.
substantial user of electric energy. So it's
Right.
the disconnect is there, but
And more
it's
in the
not quite
developing
complete.
world.
Not
Yeah.
quite complete.
So back, kind of.
James Sang, this is a very trivial question. Deborah Gordon said that Dr. Kopp was going to tell us how we can get a copy of the report.
Oh,
You have enough numbers floating around, but I think an evaluation require looking at it, actually.
no, I have good news for you. It will take, the bad news is that it will take a couple of weeks probably, because there is a formal process of getting this out of the House. But once it is there, then everybody of you will have the opportunity to get copies free of charge. It is the strict policy of the World Bank now to make everything available for free over the net. So you can buy it, but you can also download it for free.
Thank you, Chuck Kushin, Center for Clean Air Policy. We did a report called Growing Wealthier last year that made the economic case for an accessibility-based reform agenda. It was for here in the United States, but it would certainly apply elsewhere. So we're certainly on board with this. But I'm wondering how the World Bank sees the implementation path, because as you correctly pointed out, you know, if you start raising the price of fuel, there's an equity issue, and this is one of the reasons why people live in the cheaper areas and so on. Do you have an implementation path which balances the land use with the transportation, or do you see one leading the other?
Yes. No, I mean, there is the expectation that introducing signals of the external costs of transport will change endogenously land use. The sprawl is a consequence of residents to get away from high land rents and increasing land rents in the inner cities. And the cheaper transport is, the easier it is to get away from the high land rents and get to lower land rents by a greater disconnect from jobs and residential locations. Once the true social costs are clear to the consumers, this balance will change and people will find it disadvantaged to be far away from the inner cities and will rather want to live closer to the location of the jobs, and there will be endogenously, even without an independent change in land use planning, there will be a tendency to more compact cities.
I think I agree with him, but it is still mediated by those urban grammars, by all those rule books, all those expectations, all those stories about the past, how quickly that change happens. And it also depends on how closely the population watches it. For example, there has been a very interesting piece of work on Seattle, trying to identify where Seattle actually becomes denser. And Seattle is becoming denser as a city by lots of high-rises and medium-rise buildings, but they very often get hidden in spaces where the bulk of the population doesn't see them. And you can change that with a change in land use policy, and that is part of the story, how to allow existing cities to take up those signals which then come up and do that with good grace. That will be a very tricky business.
I guess I just wanted to add to that. I think that it also is very different between developed countries and developing countries in the sense that in developed countries, we're only starting to understand where the conflicts are in terms of policy for land uses and how they can be supported, or how do you plan an integrated land use and transportation process? How does that actually happen? What are the market incentives, myriad of them, that are incentivizing development in a host of different ways that are completely divorced from transportation planning? So a bit of the rule book idea there. In the developing world, I think that there's really a lot of work to be done on legitimizing development patterns that are really, in some ways, illegible to conventional ways of thinking about land use and transportation. So I think that there's a lot of areas in these megacities that are unmapped, and they do have their inherent transportation system, they have their inherent land use. Some of them are quite organized, and some of them are not. How do we support their incredible growth and legitimize what's going on? I think that there's very different integration of land use and transportation there.
Hello, Philip Andrew Speed from German Marshall Fund. My question arises from having watched China for the last 30 years take an American path rather than a Japanese path. And I was looking at your graph that you had early on of GDP against road usage, and I was thinking, is it urban design that determines transport, or is it the other way round? Is it transport policy that determines urban design? And then it struck me, as I'm an energy specialist, that the successful cities in your graph were in countries, or the successful countries were those that have essentially almost no oil reserves. The ones at the top at critical times had vast oil reserves, and Europe is somewhere in the middle. So I wonder if the causal chain is a little longer than is coming out of the discussion here.
No, thank you. It's of course possible that import substitution has been a co-driver of what we see in the transport sector. That's also very likely. But I think that the recognition of organizing a dense settlement jointly, having an integrated planning of settlements and transport system has driven what has happened in the successful countries. And I mean, we are trying to explore deeper into how this evolved. I'm in a project with Korea. We had a conference 2 days ago where we want to have the history of transport policy retold of Korea that has led to the patterns we observe and give kind of a role model where the right decisions have been taken even without having all these fancy concepts that we are talking about now. And this is something very exciting and that we use to combine with our narrative to inform our narrative of how the differences in the pattern have been brought about and how this should bear on the policy discussion we are having now.
I think one has to be careful just to look at an XY graph because there's obviously Z's and W's in the equation. And certainly, let's say for Hong Kong, we do know that the British government funded its colony by land sales. So they had an interest to keep land prices high, to maximize the revenue, so they didn't mind the density. Saudi Arabia has an interest of the ruling house, the royal house has an interest to make everyone feel they get a share of the wealth, so they essentially give oil away for free. Switzerland and other places in Europe had other policy constraints. The Germans, for example, clearly wanted to do nothing against their big car industry. So there's always other variables which need to be introduced. But I think the key issue when you talk about China is the question of, and that takes us more than beyond the urban discussion, is what is the image of a good life? And that image of a good life will vary by country, will vary by current circumstances, by expectations. And clearly, the image of the good life is the car and the big house. And it isn't yet the big flat on top of a 30-story high-rise, at least in most parts of the world. So we'll have to see at that question of what defines people as a good life and how does that translate both in transport as well as in urban form to guarantee that.
So there are 2 rule books to change.
I might add to this. In this, what is important to us is that we avoid that there are mistakes in the perception of what is a good life. I have been advisor to the city government of Riyadh, who want a light rail system now, after they have been confronted with a report stating that 40% of their 14-year-olds have asthma due to the emissions from transport. And they learned this after 5 decades of rampant motorization growth, and they know that this will have costs in terms of reduced life expectancy of their kids. So the idea of a good life was something that was under misinformation. And on Hong Kong, beyond the colonization policies of the British, Hong Kong was sinking into the eternal traffic jam by the end of the 70s. And 83, the city government imposed a vehicle tax that halved vehicle ownership within 7 years. 2 years after that implementation, they thought about introducing a congestion charge, and they noticed that congestion was down to a level that it didn't make sense. And this is an example also how a fiscal implementation strategy, a drastic one, I mean, you can hardly recommend this to many countries, but has led to something of a role model. It's not that anybody complains about the infrastructure in Hong Kong. There are these league tables of the World Economic Forum, and the business leaders rank Hong Kong number 2 in the transport infrastructure quality globally.
So I think with that, we will close because it's time. I wanted to thank the panelists for this very interesting discussion on turning the right corner and for exploring some of the opportunities and real challenges we have that lie ahead on low carbon transportation. Thank you.
Thank you.